The morning I decided to take back the back 40 was a Tuesday in late October of 1983. I remember the light was thin, the color of weak tea, and the air had that sharp, clean edge that tells you the first hard frost is less than a week away. The last of the oak leaves were clinging on, a dry, papery brown, and they made a sound like whispering when the wind moved through them. That piece of land, 41.5 acres by the county plat map, had sat untouched for as long as I'd been alive, and for most of my father's life before me. It wasn't farmed. It wasn't even good pasture. It was a tangle of second-growth hickory, wild cherry, and briar, all of it growing up through a sea of fieldstone. The stones were the reason. Glacial till, everyone said. The kind of ground that grows 2 rocks for every one you pick. My grandfather had cleared the other 200 acres of this farm with mules and a stone boat, but he never touched that back piece. He'd fenced it off to keep the cattle from breaking a leg and left it to the deer and the turkey. It was considered the farm's mistake, the part you didn't talk about when you were bragging on your yields. For my whole life, it was just the place where the property line ended. But that morning, I stood at the old fence line, the wire rusted nearly through and the locust posts gone soft with rot, and I looked at it differently. I was 54 years old. My own son was grown and had a life in the city, a good one, and he had no interest in this ground beyond sentiment. My wife, Ellen, was inside, likely starting the coffee. And I was looking at those 40 acres of trouble and feeling a pull I couldn't explain. It wasn't about profit. It wasn't about expansion. It was a question that had been sitting at the back of my mind for 30 years, a quiet hum that had finally gotten loud enough to demand an answer. Later that day, my neighbor, Dale, pulled up in his new Ford pickup, a machine so clean you could see your reflection in the chrome of the grille. He idled there on the county road, the diesel engine a low rumble, and watched me for a few minutes while I took a measurement off the old gate post. He rolled down his window. The inside of that truck still smelled new. "Morning," he said. He had a way of talking that was perfectly polite but always felt like it was leading up to a judgment. "Thinking of running new fence?" I walked over, wiping my hands on my jeans. "Thinking of clearing it," I told him, nodding toward the dense woods and the gray shoulders of rock poking through the leaf litter. Dale didn't laugh. He was too polite for that. But he gave a slow, deliberate blink, the kind a man uses when he's recalibrating his opinion of his neighbor and finding it wanting. "All 40?" he asked, a slight emphasis on the number, as if to make sure I understood the scale of my foolishness. "That's the piece," I said. He looked past me, at the wall of trees and shadow. His gaze was practical. He was a good farmer, Dale was. He ran a modern operation. Big equipment, soil testing every spring, followed the university extension's recommendations to the letter. His fields were clean, his yields were predictable. He farmed with spreadsheets. "Lot of stone in there," he said, which was the country equivalent of calling me a damn fool. "I know it," I said. "You bring in a dozer for that, you're looking at 10, maybe 12,000 just to push the trees and scrape the topsoil. Then you've got a lifetime of picking rock. That is, if you can even get a machine in there. Ground's too soft in the spring, too rough the rest of the year." He was just stating facts as he saw them. He wasn't being unkind. He was being certain. That was Dale's whole personality. Certainty. "I wasn't planning on a dozer," I told him. He looked at my hands, then at the barn where my old walk-behind tractor sat, the one I used for the garden. He didn't have to say anything else. The silence was the point. "Well," he said, after a moment that stretched just long enough to be uncomfortable. "You get a crop off that, the first one's on me." He put the truck in gear and drove off, leaving a little puff of dust hanging in the cold air. I knew what would happen next. By noon, the men having coffee at the diner in town would have a version of the story. By evening, the co-op would have another. The version would grow. I was losing my mind, or I was broke and desperate, or I was just plain stubborn. I didn't mind. People need something to talk about. But I wasn't any of those things. I was just finally ready to listen to my grandfather. He'd been dead for 20 years, but he'd said something to me once, when I was a boy, standing right where I was standing now. He'd looked out at that same tangle of woods and rock, and he'd said, "The ground knows its own shape. You just have to have the patience to learn it." I didn't know what he meant then. But standing there, with Dale's polite pity hanging in the air, I had a feeling I was about to find out. I didn't know yet what the ground knew. But I suspected it knew more than the university extension, and it certainly knew more than Dale. The question was whether it would be willing to tell me. I had a feeling the price of that knowledge was going to be paid in sweat and time, two things I had more of than money. The work started not with a saw or an axe, but with walking. For the next 3 weeks, I did nothing but walk that piece of land. I walked it until the frost turned the ground hard, and then I kept walking. 2 weeks later, I got a call from the county extension agent, a young man named Kevin with a fresh degree and a clipboard full of sensible advice. Dale had likely called him, thinking he was doing me a neighborly service, trying to save me from myself with a dose of official reality. Kevin arrived in a county sedan, wearing a brand new pair of work boots that hadn't seen a speck of mud. He was earnest and well-meaning, and he carried an air of professional concern. He walked with me to the edge of the back 40, his boots crunching on the frosted grass. He looked at the dense stand of trees, the uneven ground, the telltale humps of stone everywhere. He took out his clipboard and a soil map of the county. He spread it on the hood of his car. "So," he began, his pen tapping on a section of the map colored a particular shade of institutional brown. "This parcel here. It's classified as non-arable stony loam. Very high rock content, as you can see. The recommendation for this type of land, historically, has been managed forestry or recreational use. Not agriculture," he said, agriculture, like it was a technical term I might not be familiar with. "I've seen the map," I told him quietly. "My father had a copy in his desk for 40 years, right," he said, a little thrown off. "Well, I ran some numbers for you, just to give you a baseline." He flipped a page on his clipboard. "To clear a parcel this size, with this density of timber and this level of rock contamination, you'd need a D6 class bulldozer with a root rake attachment, probably for a minimum of 200 hours. Then a track hoe with a thumb to stack the burn piles and pull the larger stones. You're looking at a machine and operator cost, conservatively, of about $300 an hour. So, for the initial clearing, you're in the neighborhood of $60,000. And that's before you even think about rock picking, liming, and amending the soil. Realistically, to get this into a state where you could put a plow to it, you're probably looking at close to $100,000, he delivered the number with a kind of gentle finality. It was a number designed to end a conversation. It was meant to be a wall I would walk into and turn around from. He looked at me, expecting a sigh, a defeated shake of the head. "I appreciate you running the numbers, Kevin," I said. "But I told Dale, I'm not bringing in a dozer." Kevin's face registered a polite confusion. "Then, how are you planning to clear it?" he asked. "With my hands," I said. And a little bit of time, he looked from me to the 40 acres of dense, rocky woods and back again. The look on his face was the same one a doctor gives you when he's trying to explain a terminal diagnosis in the kindest way possible. He clearly thought I had lost my grip on reason. "Sir," he said, his voice soft with professional sympathy. "A man could spend his entire life in there with an axe and a pry bar and not make a dent. The sheer tonnage of rock, it's not a human-scale job. That's why we have machines." "The machines see a problem," I said, more to myself than to him. "They see a flat field that's covered in obstacles. I'm not sure that's what's here." He made a few more notes on his clipboard, the kind of notes that probably said, "Landowner is sentimental, advise against any investment." He promised to mail me some pamphlets on federal grants for managed forest land, shook my hand, and left. His new boots were still clean. I watched his car disappear down the road, and I wasn't angry or discouraged. I was settled. The experts, with all their maps and their numbers, had confirmed what the land looked like from a distance. They had a name for it. They had a price for fixing it. But they had never set foot in it. They had never tried to understand it on its own terms. My reason for being out here wasn't on a map. It was in my memory. I was maybe 8 years old, following my grandfather along this same fence line. It was summer, and the air was thick with the buzz of insects. He was checking the fence, not because he was planning to fix it, but because that's what he did. He walked his land. He carried an old hickory walking stick that was worn smooth as glass from his hand. We stopped and looked into the woods. I asked him the question every child on this farm had probably asked. "Grandpa, why don't we farm this part?" He didn't answer right away. He pointed with his stick at the ground just inside the fence. "See that?" he said. "See how that little ridge of stones runs? Not just a pile. It's a line. And there's another one over there. Goes all the way to that big oak." I squinted and I could just make them out, low, moss-covered humps that snaked through the trees. To me, they just looked like more rocks. "They're not there by accident," he said. "Nothing in nature makes a straight line for that long. A man made that line. A long time ago." Then he looked down at me, his eyes the same color as the summer sky. "This piece of ground is older than we are. It remembers things we've forgotten. The ground knows its own shape. If you try to force it into a shape it doesn't want to be, it'll fight you forever. But if you learn its shape, it'll work with you." He never said another word about it. We finished walking the fence and went back to the barn. But the image of those low, green lines of stone stayed with me. The idea of the ground knowing something. That was my real reason. It wasn't about the money, or the acreage, or proving Dale and the extension agent wrong. It was about solving a riddle my grandfather had left for me 45 years earlier. It was about learning the shape of the ground. That evening, after a dinner of pot roast and potatoes, Ellen watched me pull out the old farm records. I wasn't looking for deeds or titles. I was looking for my grandfather's notebooks. He kept them in a small wooden crate he'd made from apple wood. There were a dozen of them, simple marbled composition books, the kind you'd get at the general store for a dime. Their corners were soft and rounded from years of being carried in a coat pocket. The pages were filled with his handwriting, a careful, blocky script done in pencil, the graphite gone a little brown and faint with age. He wasn't a man who wasted words. His entries were terse, practical. April 12, 1938. Plowed the south field. Broke a shear pin on the number 3 plow. Soil is holding moisture well this year, July 2, 1941. Hay is in. 1,200 bales from the high pasture. A good cutting. Rain by Friday. He recorded everything. Planting dates, rainfall totals, yields per acre, the price of corn at the elevator, the day a new calf was born, the day a good dog died. Reading those notebooks was like reading the biography of the farm itself, a year-by-year account of its life, its struggles, its small triumphs. The pages were a map of his attention. He paid attention to the soil, to the weather, to the health of his animals. He documented it all. I paged through the years, looking for any mention of the back 40. It was hardly there. For decades, it was a ghost in the records. The other fields had pages devoted to them, their crop rotations, their fertilizer applications, their quirks. The north pasture was always wet in the spring. The west field had a patch of clay in the corner that had to be worked carefully. The notebooks were full of this intimate, hard-won knowledge. But when it came to the back 40, there was almost nothing. It was as if the pen simply skipped over it. I finally found a reference in the notebook from 1947. He'd made a hand-drawn map of the whole farm on a single page, dividing it into its various fields and pastures. Each section was labeled and its acreage noted. But the back 40 was just a rough outline, labeled Back 40, unimproved, there were no notes about its soil, no history of what had been planted there. It was a blank space on his mental map. I almost closed the book, figuring that was all there was. Silence. But then I saw it, on the facing page, almost as an afterthought. A few short lines written in the same careful pencil script. The entry was undated, squeezed in at the bottom of a page filled with notes about selling 2 steers. It read, "Walked the back 40 line. Water flows north from the high ground, follows the stone ridges. Ground seems to stay wet late along the east side." Then, a few lines below that, a single sentence, underlined twice. The pressure of the pencil was so hard I could feel the ridge on the back of the page. It said, "Stones are just the skin. Never plowed," and next to it, he'd put a small, hesitant question mark. Stones are just the skin. Never plowed? It wasn't a statement. It was a question he was asking himself. A puzzle he hadn't solved. My grandfather was the most practical man I ever knew. He didn't deal in riddles or poetry. For him to write something so cryptic, so strange, and to underline it twice, it was like finding a secret message. He, too, had seen something out there that didn't fit the simple explanation of bad ground. He had seen the lines of stone, noticed the way the water moved, and he had come to a conclusion that was also a question. The stones weren't the ground itself. They were just the skin. Something was underneath. And that question mark told me everything. He had suspected something, but he never had the time, or perhaps the energy, to find out what it was. He was building a farm from scratch, raising a family through the Depression and a war. He had fields that worked, that paid the bills. He didn't have the luxury of chasing a mystery on his worst piece of land. I closed the notebook and sat there in the quiet of the living room. The clock on the mantel ticked. Ellen looked up from her knitting. "Find what you were looking for?" she asked. "I think so," I said. I found a question. I'll own that I put the notebook back in the crate that night and didn't open it again for a week. I wasn't ready. The weight of that underlined sentence was heavier than I expected. It was a piece of inherited work. A job left unfinished. My grandfather had handed me a map, but a map to a place he'd never been himself. The modern experts had their maps, too, the ones with the colored soil types and the dollar signs. Their map said, "Turn back." My grandfather's map just had a single, cryptic clue and a question mark. The next morning, I didn't walk the fence line. I went into the barn, found my grandfather's old pry bar, a 5-foot length of solid steel, heavy and smooth from use, and I walked into the woods. The work was about to begin. It was time to see if I could get under the skin. The first day, I did almost nothing. I spent 8 hours inside that 40-acre tangle and I moved maybe 5 stones. It was humbling work. The ground was a mattress of decaying leaves, 6 inches deep in some places, hiding roots and smaller rocks. Every step was uncertain. I chose a spot, not for any strategic reason, but because it was the first place I'd come to where a line of those mossy stones seemed to surface, like the spine of some buried creature. My tools were simple. The long steel pry bar, a pair of thick leather gloves, a mattock for cutting through the surface roots. That was it. No engine, no hydraulics. Just muscle and leverage and boneheaded persistence. The first stone was about the size of a bushel basket. It looked simple enough, half buried in the black earth. I worked the mattock around its edges, clearing away the soil and the web of roots that clung to it. Then I took the pry bar, found a purchase underneath, and put my weight into it. The bar bent slightly, the steel groaning, and the rock shifted. 1/4 of an inch. I did it again. Another 1/2 inch. It was like trying to move a mountain with a toothpick. After an hour of straining, of finding new angles, of using smaller rocks as fulcrums, I finally levered it out of its socket. It came free with a deep, sucking sound, leaving a perfect, dark impression in the earth. I sat down on a log, breathing heavily, my back and shoulders already screaming in protest. I had moved one rock. There were perhaps a million more. It was at that moment that the scale of what Kevin, the extension agent, had been talking about became real. This wasn't a human-scale job. It was madness. I almost walked out right then. I could hear Dale's polite, certain voice in my head. I could see the columns of numbers on Kevin's clipboard. They were right. But then I looked at the hole where the rock had been. The soil at the bottom was black. Not brown, not gray. It was a deep, rich, crumbly black, the color of midnight. It smelled sweet and earthy, full of life. I'd spent my whole life farming, and I knew soil. I knew it by sight, by smell, by feel. This was grade A topsoil. The kind of stuff you pay a fortune for at a garden center. And it was here, under a rock, on the worst piece of land on the farm. I remembered my grandfather's note, "Stones are just the skin." I stood up. I moved to the next rock in the line. This one was bigger. The work went on like that for weeks. I fell into a rhythm. I'd go out every morning after my chores, work until my body gave out, come in for lunch, and often go back out for a few more hours in the afternoon. Ellen would watch me come in, covered in dirt and sweat, my hands raw even through the gloves. She never said I was a fool. She just made sure there was a hot meal ready and liniment for my shoulders. Some days, I'd clear a patch the size of a pickup truck bed. Other days, I'd spend half the day on a single, stubborn stone that refused to budge. I wasn't trying to clear the whole 40 acres. I was just following that one line of rock, the one my grandfather had pointed out to me as a boy. I was treating it not as an obstacle, but as a path. As I worked, I started to see what he had seen. This wasn't a random scattering of glacial till. The stones were arranged. The line I was following was too straight, too consistent, to be an accident of geology. It was a wall, or what was left of one. Most of it was buried, with only the top course of stones showing through the leaf litter. The trees had grown up through it and around it, their roots wrapping around the stones, locking them in place. I had to cut the roots first, then attack the stones. I wasn't clearing a field. I was performing surgery on the land, carefully dissecting the layers of time. The trees were a century of neglect. The leaf litter was 50 years of accumulation. And underneath it all were these stones, placed there by a human hand for a purpose I didn't yet understand. About a month into the work, I made a discovery. I had been prying up a section of the wall where a big hickory tree had pushed it apart. One of the foundation stones was a massive, flat slab of granite, almost 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. It took me 2 days to get it loose. When I finally levered it up and rolled it over, I saw that the underside was not smooth. It had been worked. There were marks on it. Not writing, but a series of deep, parallel grooves cut into the stone, like a giant tally sheet. Someone, a long, long time ago, had shaped this rock and used it for something before it became part of this wall. My hands were shaking as I ran my fingers over the grooves. They were worn smooth by time and earth, but they were unmistakably man-made. This wasn't just a farm wall. This was something else. This was older. I stopped thinking of myself as a man clearing a field. I was an archaeologist. The thought was so absurd I almost laughed out loud. Me, with a high school education and dirt under my fingernails, an archaeologist. But that's what it felt like. I wasn't imposing my will on the land. I was uncovering a story that was already there, written in stone and soil. I was starting to learn the shape of the ground. And its shape was nothing like what was on the county maps. The work changed as winter set in. The ground froze hard, locking the stones in place. I couldn't move them anymore. So I changed my approach. I traded the pry bar for a chainsaw and an axe. My new task was to clear the trees. But I didn't clear them indiscriminately. I only took down the trees growing directly on top of or within a few feet of the stone line I was tracing. I was giving the wall breathing room, exposing it to the winter light. It was slow, careful work. Felling a tree in a dense, uneven forest is a dangerous business. Each one had to be dropped precisely, to avoid damaging the other trees or myself. I cut the wood into lengths I could handle, splitting it and stacking it into cords. By January, I had a dozen cords of prime hickory and cherry firewood stacked along the old fence line, more than we'd need for 2 winters. Dale drove by one afternoon while I was loading the splitter. He stopped his truck. "Putting in a woodlot?" he asked. The question was casual, but the implication was clear. I had given up on the foolish idea of farming the land and settled for a more sensible, if less ambitious, project. "Just clearing a path," I said, and left it at that. I didn't try to explain the wall, or the marks on the stone, or the feeling I had about the soil. It wasn't something you could explain to a man who only trusted spreadsheets. It was something you had to feel in your bones, in the ache of your muscles after a long day's work. You had to earn the right to see it. When the spring thaw finally came, the ground softened, and I went back to the stones. But now, I wasn't just following one line. I had spent the winter walking, marking other likely lines with bright orange flagging tape. A pattern was beginning to emerge from the chaos. It wasn't one long wall. It was a network. A grid. My grandfather's words came back to me: water flows north from the high ground, follows the stone ridges. I saw it now. The walls weren't just fences. They were channels. They were terraces. They were a sophisticated system for managing water and soil on a sloped, rocky piece of ground. The people who built this weren't fighting the rocks, they were using them. They had built small, level plots, each one enclosed by a low stone wall. The walls would slow the runoff from the spring rains, trapping the topsoil and the water, preventing erosion. They had taken a difficult piece of land and, through immense labor and clever design, had turned it into a productive garden. As I cleared the first of these enclosures, a plot maybe 50 feet square, the truth of it became undeniable. Inside the low stone walls, the soil was a foot deep, dark and friable. Just outside the wall, where the runoff had carried the soil away for centuries, the ground was thin, acidic, and pale. The stones weren't the problem. The stones were the solution. The entire 40 acres was a mosaic of these small, walled plots. A patchwork quilt of ancient fields, buried under a century of forest. Stones are just the skin. Never plowed? My grandfather's question finally made sense. This land had never been plowed in the modern sense. No tractor, no moldboard plow had ever turned this soil. It couldn't. The plots were too small, the walls too close together. This land hadn't been farmed. It had been gardened. Intensively. And then, for some reason, it had been abandoned. Left to the trees. I started to use a soil probe, a simple T-handled steel rod that you push into the ground to check its depth and composition. I laid out a grid across the first few acres I had started to uncover. The results were astonishing. Inside the stone-walled plots, I consistently measured between 18 and 24 inches of rich, black topsoil. Outside the walls, on the slopes between them, I was lucky to find 4 inches before hitting hardpan clay or solid rock. The county soil map, the one Kevin had shown me, was an average. It had taken this incredibly rich and complex piece of ground and averaged it out to non-arable stony loam. The map was a lie. Not a deliberate lie, but a lie of omission. A lie of scale. It was like describing a library by measuring the thickness of its walls instead of reading the books inside. I had uncovered maybe 2 acres of the grid by the end of that first year. 2 acres out of 40. It was a staggering amount of work for such a small return. By any modern economic measure, it was a failure. I had invested 1,000 hours of my own labor and had nothing to sell. But I had an answer to my grandfather's question. And I had a feeling that the value of this land wasn't going to be measured in bushels per acre, but in something much older. That summer, I didn't plant corn or soybeans. I put in a small test plot in one of the cleared enclosures. I planted tomatoes, squash, and beans, the old three sisters. I worked the soil by hand, with a broad fork and a hoe. I didn't need a tractor. The soil was so loose and well drained, it was a joy to work. The plants grew with a vigor I had never seen before. The tomato vines were thick as my thumb, and they loaded up with fruit so heavy I had to add extra stakes to hold them up. The squash grew so fast you could almost watch it happen. It was as if the soil had been sleeping for 100 years, and it was waking up with a ferocious appetite for life. I was not just a farmer. I was a steward of something ancient. By the second spring, I had uncovered nearly 10 acres of the grid. The work had found its own pace. It was no longer a frantic effort but a steady, methodical process. Clear the trees, stack the wood, move the stones, define the walls, work the soil. Repeat. The back 40 was beginning to look less like a forest and more like a landscape. A series of terraces and garden plots stepped down the gentle slope, the gray stone walls like stitching holding the whole thing together. It was beautiful, in a rugged, ancient way. People started to notice. The talk at the diner shifted from pity to curiosity. I'd see cars slow down on the county road, people trying to get a look at what the old fool was doing back in the woods. One Saturday, a car I didn't recognize pulled into the lane. An older man got out. He was tall and thin, with a fringe of white hair and a pair of wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose. He moved slowly, deliberately, and carried a worn leather satchel. "You the fellow who's been moving all the rocks?" he asked. His voice was quiet, academic. "I'm the one," I said. "My name is Elias Vance," he said, holding out a hand. "I'm with the County Historical Society. I heard a rumor something interesting was happening out here." "I hope you don't mind the intrusion." "No intrusion at all," I said. Glad for the company, I walked him back to the plots I had cleared. He didn't say much at first. He just looked. He walked the lines of the stone walls, his long fingers tracing the moss on the rocks. He knelt down and crumbled the dark soil between his fingers. He had the kind of deep, patient silence that meant he was truly seeing, not just looking. He spent almost an hour walking the grid, peering at the stones, pacing out the dimensions of the plots. I just followed him, letting him work. Finally, he came back to where I was standing and looked at me over the top of his glasses. "You know what you have here, don't you?" he asked. "I have a theory," I said. "I think it's an old farm." "A very old one." He smiled, a small, genuine smile. "It's older than that," he said. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a rolled-up map. It was a copy of a survey map from the early 1800s. He spread it out on a flat-topped stone. "This is one of the first surveys of this area," he said. "Look here." He pointed to the parcel of land that corresponded with my farm. The main fields were marked, but the back 40 was drawn as just a featureless block of woodland. "But," he said, his finger tracing a faint, dotted line along the creek at the bottom of the property, "the surveyor made a note here." He squinted at the old script. "It says, Old Indian Gardening Grounds on the high slope. Long abandoned." Elias looked up at me. "This isn't a colonial farm. What you've uncovered, this is almost certainly a pre-contact agricultural site. Maybe late woodland period. We're talking 800, 1,000 years ago. What you're calling garden plots, an archaeologist would call raised fields or check dam terraces. This is one of the most sophisticated and best preserved examples I have ever seen." "Anywhere." He went quiet then. He just stood there, looking out over the stone walls and the dark earth, his face a mixture of awe and reverence. The expert who goes quiet. His silence was more validating than 1,000 words of praise. He finally turned to me. The university would kill to get a team in here, he said. To do a proper dig. This could rewrite the history of agriculture in this entire region. I thought about that for a minute. A team of people in white coats, with screens and little brushes, cordoning off my land with tape. I appreciate that, Elias, I told him. But this ground hasn't been disturbed for a long, long time. I think I'd like to keep it that way. It was a garden then. It's a garden now, he nodded slowly, a look of understanding on his face. I think you're right, he said. Some things are better left as living history. He stayed for another hour, asking me questions about how I'd found the patterns, what the soil was like. Before he left, he stood at the edge of the clearing and looked back. You didn't clear a field, he said, his voice full of a quiet respect. You woke one up. His visit was the vindication. Not because he was an expert with a title, but because he saw what I saw. He confirmed that I wasn't crazy. I had listened to the ground, and it had told me a story that had been waiting 1,000 years to be heard. The proof, though, was in the soil itself. That fall, I took soil samples from the cleared plots and, for comparison, from Dale's prize-winning cornfield across the road. I paid the $50 to have the university lab, the same one that employed Kevin, run a full analysis. The results came back 2 weeks later. Dale's soil was good, no question. He amended it every year. But my soil, the soil from the ancient garden, was in another category altogether. The organic matter content was 14%. Dale's was 4%, which was considered excellent for our area. My soil was teeming with microbial life, with a perfect balance of nutrients. It needed no lime, no fertilizer. It was, according to the notes from the lab technician, exceptionally rich and, of a quality rarely seen in agricultural contexts. I had the numbers now. The land wasn't just old. It was perfect. By the 5th year, I had uncovered nearly all of the workable plots. It turned out to be not 40 acres of farmland, but about 32 acres of small, interconnected gardens, woven into the landscape. The other 8 acres were the slopes and ravines between them, which I left wooded, letting them continue their work of holding the land together. I didn't farm it in the modern sense. I couldn't. No tractor would fit, no combine could harvest it. I worked it with a walk-behind tractor for the initial tilling and with hand tools for everything else. It was more work, but it was a different kind of work. It was attention. I found I could grow specialty crops that commanded a high price. Heirloom vegetables, garlic, herbs, cut flowers. I sold them at the farmers' market in the city and directly to a few high-end restaurants. The chefs marveled at the quality, the depth of flavor. "What's your secret?" one of them asked me once. "Good soil and a lot of time," I told him. I wasn't getting rich, but I was making a comfortable living off a piece of land everyone had told me was worthless. I was paying the taxes and then some. More importantly, I was content. The work was hard, but it was honest, and it fed my soul as much as it fed my bank account. The back 40 had become the heart of the farm. One evening in late summer, Dale pulled his truck up to the fence line again. It was a newer model now, but just as clean. He'd been watching me for years, from a distance, never saying much. But I'd see him pause his combine in the field across the road and just look over at the patchwork of green and gray stone on my hillside. He got out of the truck this time. He walked over to the fence, his boots dusty from his own fields. He leaned on a post and looked out at what I had done. From the road, you could see the whole expanse of it now. The neat stone walls, the lush green of the growing plants, the dark, rich soil between the rows. It looked like a piece of the old world dropped into the middle of modern farming country. He was quiet for a long time. I just waited. Dale wasn't a man for small talk. "Looks different," he said finally. "It is different," I said. He nodded, his eyes scanning the terraces. "Soil looks good," it was the highest compliment he was capable of giving. It was his version of a full-throated apology, a retraction of every doubt he'd ever had. It was the quiet concession. "It is good," I said. He chewed on that for a minute. "You ever figure out what it cost you?" he asked. "To clear all this?" I knew what he meant. He was thinking in terms of dollars per hour, of machine costs, of return on investment. The way he and Kevin the extension agent thought. "I suppose if I'd paid myself an hourly wage, I'd have a number for you," I said. "But that seems like the wrong way to measure it. I got a lifetime of firewood. I got a good workout. And I got to solve a puzzle my grandfather left me." I looked out at the fields. "And I got all this. So I guess you could say it paid me back every day." Dale nodded again, a slow, thoughtful motion. He wasn't just looking at a field anymore. I think, for the first time, he was seeing the shape of the ground. "Well," he said, turning to go. I was wrong. He got back in his truck and drove away. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The work was there for anyone to see. The land had spoken, and I had simply been the one to write down its dictation. That evening, I sat on the porch with Ellen, watching the sun go down behind the hills. The back 40 was bathed in a warm, golden light. It didn't look like a farm. It looked like a promise that had been kept. My grandfather was right. The ground knows its own shape. It knows its own history. It knows what it wants to be. Most of the time, we're too busy and too loud to listen to it. We come with our big machines and our big plans, and we try to force it into the shape we want. A flat field. A square plot. A straight line. We think the stones are the problem, that the trees are the enemy, that the slope is a mistake to be corrected. But sometimes, the problem is the map. Sometimes, the lesson is in the thing you're trying to clear away. The stones weren't a flaw. They were the instructions. The whole story was written right there on the land, waiting for someone to come along who was quiet enough, and patient enough, to read it. It took me 5 years, but I learned how to read the stone and the soil. I learned that the best tools are not always the fastest or the most powerful. Sometimes, the best tools are a strong back, a curious mind, and a willingness to be proven wrong. I learned that the wisdom of one old man, passed down in a dusty notebook, can be worth more than all the expert advice in the world. The ground remembers. That's the lesson. It remembers the people who cared for it 1,000 years ago. It remembers the shape they gave it. And if you treat it with respect, if you work with it instead of against it, it will reward you in ways you can't measure on a spreadsheet. If you've got a piece of your own stubborn ground, a place that everyone else has written off, I'd like to hear about it in the comments. Maybe it's not a problem to be solved. Maybe it's a story waiting to be read. Thanks for listening. Subscribe if it meant something to you.